a quiet March afternoon in 2015, a small apartment complex in Longmont, Colorado, became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing crimes in recent memory. What began as a simple meeting between two women, strangers connected through an online ad for free maternity clothes, would spiral into an act of unimaginable violence. One of them, 26-year-old Michelle Wilkins, was 7 months pregnant and excited to meet someone offering items for her soon-to-be-born daughter. The other, 34-year-old Dynel Lane, appeared friendly, warm, and welcoming, the kind of person you might trust without hesitation. But beneath that surface was a secret, a deception that had been building for months. By the end of that day, Michelle would be fighting for her life in a hospital intensive care unit. Her unborn child, a baby girl, would not survive. And investigators would uncover a truth so shocking it would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. A story of loss, lies, and desperation that culminated in a violent act, rarely seen outside of nightmares. This is the story of a crime born from a false pregnancy, fueled by months of careful deception, and carried out in a way that defies belief. Michelle Wilkins was in the final stretch of her pregnancy when she came across a Craigslist ad that seemed almost too perfectly timed. It offered free maternity clothes, gently used items that could help any expectant mother save money. For Michelle, it wasn't just about the clothes, it was about preparing for the next chapter of her life. She and her boyfriend were excited about welcoming their first child together. They had already chosen a name for their daughter, Aurora. They imagined a future filled with bedtime stories, first steps, and laughter filling their home. Michelle was practical and calm, the kind of person who approached her pregnancy with a mix of excitement and quiet determination. Friends and family described her as kind-hearted and trusting, someone who believed in seeing the good in people. She was the type who would smile at strangers, make conversation in the grocery store line, and help a neighbor without thinking twice. That trusting nature had never failed her, until the day she met Dynel Lane. Michelle's pregnancy had been healthy. She had no reason to imagine danger in a simple trip to pick up clothing. In her mind, this meeting was an opportunity to connect with another mother, maybe even share stories about pregnancy and parenting. The ad had been worded casually, almost warmly, and Michelle saw no red flags. But behind that ad was a person she knew nothing about. A person with a past Michelle could never have imagined. To understand what happened that March afternoon, we have to step into the life of the woman Michelle knew only as Dee. Her real name was Dynel Lane, and she was 34 years old at the time of the attack. On the surface, she seemed like an ordinary woman, a mother of 2 teenage daughters, living in a modest apartment with her fiancé, Dave. But behind closed doors, Lane's life was far more complicated. Years earlier, tragedy had struck when Lane lost her young son in a drowning accident. He had wandered into a pond and slipped beneath the water before anyone could save him. That loss left a permanent mark on her, a wound she carried quietly for years. Friends said she never truly recovered. Some spoke of a deep longing that followed her, a yearning for another baby, perhaps to fill the emptiness left by her son's death. In the years after, Lane underwent a surgical procedure to have her fallopian tubes tied. She told people it had been her partner's decision at the time, that he didn't want more children. The surgery meant she could no longer become pregnant naturally, but not everyone in her life knew that detail. When she met Dave, she never told him she couldn't have children. In fact, she eventually told him she was pregnant. Friends noticed the changes. She started wearing maternity clothes, talking about due dates, and even hosting a baby shower. Social media showed photos of her with a small baby bump. She registered for baby gifts and spoke about the child as if she were certain he was on the way. She named the unborn baby James and told friends the due date was in November 2014. But when that date came and went, Lane offered excuses. She told some people the doctors had been wrong about the timing. She claimed the pregnancy had complications. She moved the due date to December, then to early 2015. Meanwhile, Dave grew suspicious. He wanted to go with her to prenatal appointments, but each time she found a way to cancel or go alone. She claimed doctors were rescheduling, that she was switching clinics, or that unexpected problems had come up. In reality, there were no appointments and no baby. By February 2015, Dave's patience was wearing thin. He told Lane that if he couldn't go to a doctor's appointment with her by the beginning of March, their relationship might be over. She agreed to an appointment date. That date was eventually set for the afternoon of March 18, 2015. But that morning, instead of preparing for a real prenatal visit, Dynel Lane placed an ad on Craigslist offering free maternity clothes. Somewhere in her mind, a plan had begun to take shape. Craigslist was, at the time, a common place for neighbors and strangers alike to buy, sell, and trade almost anything. From furniture to baby clothes, the listings ranged from urgent sales to casual giveaways. In the maternity section, one post stood out: an offer for free maternity clothes, no strings attached. It wasn't flashy. The words were simple, the tone warm. The kind of ad that might have been written by someone simply wanting to help another mother-to-be. For Michelle Wilkins, it seemed like the perfect find. Michelle reached out, and the woman behind the ad, Dynel Lane, responded. Messages went back and forth, and they arranged a time for Michelle to come by. The address was in Longmont, a relatively quiet city with a small-town feel, surrounded by mountain views. The apartment complex itself was unremarkable. Beige siding, shared parking, narrow hallways. For Michelle, this wasn't just about the clothes. Meeting another expectant mother felt like a small connection in the shared experience of pregnancy. In Lane's messages, there was nothing to suggest danger, no urgency, no odd demands, just a simple invitation to stop by. On the morning of March 18th, Michelle prepared for the visit. She didn't rush. There was no reason to. She was in her third trimester, moving with the careful pace of someone carrying new life. Aurora, her unborn daughter, was healthy and active. When she arrived just before noon, Lane welcomed her inside. The two women talked for a while, discussing their pregnancies, their children, and everyday life. Lane spoke casually about her own due date, claiming it had already passed. She mentioned her two daughters, her fiancé, and the quiet rhythm of her days. Michelle noticed that Lane's apartment was tidy but lived in. Toys and children's items suggested a family home. It felt safe, normal. There was nothing in the atmosphere to hint at what would happen next. As the conversation stretched on, Michelle began to make her way toward the door. She thanked Lane for the clothes, ready to leave. But Lane wasn't finished. She mentioned having more items downstairs, in the basement. It was an offer that seemed harmless, even generous. And so Michelle agreed to take a quick look. She had no way of knowing that by following Lane down those stairs, she was walking into the heart of a carefully laid plan. It was late morning in Longmont, Colorado. Outside, the day was calm, a typical early spring day on the Front Range. Inside Dynel Lane's apartment, the scene was equally still. Her two teenage daughters were at school. Her fiancé, Dave, was at work. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels natural in the middle of the day. Michelle Wilkins stepped inside shortly before noon. She was shown to an upstairs bedroom where Lane had laid out maternity clothes, shirts, dresses, and other items neatly folded. The women talked about their pregnancies. Lane spoke warmly about her supposed due date and about raising girls. Noting she already had two daughters, Michelle shared that she was expecting a baby girl, Aurora. The conversation meandered, touching on family routines, partners, and the challenges of preparing for a newborn. For Michelle, it was just two expectant mothers sharing a moment. Lane seemed calm, even friendly, though perhaps a little lonely. At one point, the mail arrived, a package for Lane. She opened it at the counter, revealing bottles of essential oils she said she planned to sell. She handled a kitchen knife to open the box, then set it down nearby. After more small talk, Michelle decided it was time to go. She thanked Lane for the clothes and began to move toward the door. Lane, however, closed it gently but firmly, saying she had more items to show, things stored downstairs in the basement. It was a seemingly harmless suggestion. Michelle followed her down a narrow set of steps into the dim basement. Lane moved toward a corner, appearing to search through boxes. Michelle glanced around the space. Laundry machines, a few scattered toys, storage bins. Then something shifted. Lane's voice grew quieter. Her movements became less about searching and more about positioning herself. Michelle started to back toward the stairs, telling Lane she really didn't need anything else. But in that moment, the plan Lane had been building for months was ready to unfold. What happened next was sudden. As Michelle turned toward the stairs, Lane struck from behind. The blow was hard, unexpected, and disorienting, delivered with the flat of her hand, enough to make Michelle stumble. Confused, Michelle's first thought was that something must have brushed against her, maybe a spider or some stray object. But before she could speak, Lane's hands were on her sweater, pulling her around to face the other way. The friendly tone from minutes earlier was gone. In its place was a sharp, frantic aggression. Lane began lifting Michelle's sweater roughly, her movements urgent and invasive. Michelle protested, telling her she didn't want any trouble, that she just wanted to leave. But Lane's response was to push harder, to drive her back toward the bathroom in the basement. Michelle resisted, bracing her body against the doorway. That resistance only seemed to fuel Lane's determination. The struggle grew more violent, hands grasping, shoving, grappling for control. Then came the first strike with the glass lamp. The heavy object shattered, sending shards across the room. One jagged edge became a weapon. Lane used it to stab Michelle in the neck, a wound that sent a sharp wave of pain through her. Blood followed quickly. Michelle's strength began to fade as Lane's hands found her throat. The pressure was relentless. Each second of choking felt longer than the last, the edges of Michelle's vision darkening as oxygen slipped away. At some point, her body gave in. She slipped into unconsciousness. While Michelle lay still, Lane moved quickly. She retrieved the knife from upstairs, the same one she had used to open her package earlier, and returned to perform a crude cesarean section. It was not random or wild. The cut was deliberate, precise enough to suggest knowledge of anatomy. Within minutes, the baby was out. Lane wrapped the tiny premature girl and carried her upstairs. Michelle was left alone in the basement, bleeding heavily, her body broken but still alive. Upstairs, Dynel Lane moved with a sense of grim purpose. She placed the premature baby, barely over 3 pounds, into an empty bathtub. The bathroom was small, the white porcelain a stark backdrop for the tiny newborn. Lane left her there and turned her attention to the basement. Back downstairs, the scene was chaotic. Shards of glass from the shattered lamp littered the floor. Blood pooled on the bedding where Michelle had collapsed. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of it. Lane began gathering what she could, sweeping glass, smearing away bloodstains, even tossing broken pieces into the washing machine in an attempt to conceal them. She was still cleaning when a thought interrupted her. Dave. Her fiancé's schedule was predictable, but any unexpected arrival could unravel everything. She picked up her phone and called him, asking if he had already left work. She suggested he stop at their daughter's school to run an errand, her voice steady but slightly rushed. She didn't know he was already on his way home. In the basement, Michelle drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time she woke, the pain in her neck and abdomen hit her like a wave. Breathing was difficult. Moving was worse. But somewhere in the fog, a single thought anchored her. She needed to get help. When Dave walked in the door, the scene was not what he expected. Lane appeared in the hallway covered in blood, telling him she had just given birth. She guided him to the bathroom where the newborn lay. Dave's first instinct was to act, to get both of them to the hospital as quickly as possible. He helped Lane into the car with the baby, not knowing what had happened just a floor below his feet. And so they left, the apartment door closing behind them. The basement was silent again except for the faint, ragged breathing of the woman Lane had left for dead. Alone in the basement, Michelle fought to stay conscious. Every breath was shallow, each movement sending sharp pain through her neck and stomach. She could feel the warmth of her own blood soaking into the bedding beneath her. The room seemed dimmer now, the edges of her vision threatening to close in completely. She knew she didn't have long. Her phone was somewhere nearby. With what strength she had left, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the smooth glass screen. It was cracked, smeared with blood, but still working. She dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm but urgent, asking her to explain what had happened. Speaking was hard. Her throat hurt from the strangling, her voice faint from blood loss. But she managed to get the words out. She told them she'd been attacked, that she was pregnant, that she was bleeding badly. She tried to describe her location, focusing on small details she could still remember. The dispatcher urged her to keep talking, to stay awake. They told her to press anything she could find against her wound, to try to slow the bleeding. Michelle followed the instructions as best she could, pressing fabric to her abdomen, holding pressure despite the pain. Minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the apartment above. Doors opened. Voices called out. First responders followed the trail of blood to the basement and found her, pale, shaking, but alive. They worked quickly, stabilizing her enough to carry her upstairs and into the waiting ambulance. She was rushed toward Longmont Hospital, lights and sirens cutting through the calm of the afternoon. The baby, she told them, was gone. While paramedics raced Michelle toward the emergency room, another arrival at Longmont Hospital was already attracting attention. Moments earlier, Dynel Lane had walked in, cradling a newborn wrapped in a blanket. Beside her was Dave, unaware of what had really happened. Lane told staff she had given birth at home. She appeared calm, though her clothing and hands were stained with blood. Her explanation was simple. The baby had come quickly, unexpectedly. She hadn't had time to get to the hospital. But to the trained eyes of medical staff, certain details didn't add up. Lane showed no signs of having recently given birth. There was no postpartum bleeding, no physical changes expected after labor. And the cuts on her hands, one deep between the thumb and forefinger, were inconsistent with her story. An obstetrician entered the room to examine her, but Lane refused a full check. She clutched the newborn close, insisting she was fine. The baby was taken briefly for examination. She was small, far smaller than a full-term infant, and showed signs of extreme prematurity. Back at the apartment, police were making their own discoveries. When they learned the address belonged to Lane, the picture began to shift. They knew now that the injured pregnant woman in the basement and the woman at the hospital with a newborn were connected. The newborn was moved into a separate area, placed under police watch. Staff began running tests to assess her condition. She weighed just over 3 pounds, her tiny chest rising and falling with fragile breaths. As officers quietly converged on Lane's room, suspicion was quickly hardening into something more. 2 women had entered the hospital that day, one barely clinging to life after a violent attack, and one claiming a birth that the evidence suggested never happened. It was only a matter of time before their stories collided. At the hospital, detectives approached Dynel Lane's room carefully. She still held to her story, that she had gone into labor unexpectedly, that the baby was hers, and that she had been alone all day. She said she couldn't remember exactly how far along she was. She spoke vaguely about feeling the baby move the previous summer. The officers listened but pressed for details. Each answer seemed to bring more questions. Why were her hands cut? Why was the baby so premature if her due date had already passed? Why did she refuse a medical exam that could confirm her story? As investigators compared her account to what they were learning from the crime scene, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. At Lane's apartment, police had found Michelle's cracked phone, smeared with blood. Text messages confirmed Michelle had arrived there shortly before noon to collect maternity clothes. In the basement, they documented a violent struggle, bloodstains, shards of broken glass, and signs of attempted cleanup. Officers learned that Lane had told her fiancé, friends, and family she was pregnant for nearly a year. She had changed her due date multiple times and avoided all prenatal appointments. There was no medical record of her pregnancy anywhere in the region, and years earlier she had undergone a tubal ligation, a surgical procedure to prevent pregnancy. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Lane had been living a lie, constructing a false pregnancy and maintaining it even as months passed beyond her supposed due date. Friends described her as secretive but convincing, always with an excuse when asked for proof. She'd even hosted a baby shower complete with a cake that read, "Welcome, James." Detectives began to suspect that Lane's pregnancy claim had been leading toward something, that she needed to produce a baby to maintain her story. That suspicion, combined with the evidence from the apartment and the testimony from Michelle's 911 call, began to form the outline of a motive. Back at the hospital, Michelle was still in surgery, her survival uncertain. Lane, meanwhile, continued to insist that the child was hers, but a simple DNA test could resolve the question, and investigators told her so. It was only then that Lane's version of events began to shift. In the operating room, doctors worked quickly to save Michelle Wilkins' life. The injuries were extensive. A deep wound to her neck from the broken glass lamp had damaged muscle and tissue dangerously close to vital blood vessels. Her abdomen had been cut open in a crude cesarean section, the incision precise enough to suggest some anatomical knowledge, yet done without any sterile conditions. She had lost a massive amount of blood. Without rapid intervention, she would have gone into irreversible shock within minutes. Surgeons stemmed the bleeding, repaired the abdominal wall, and treated the neck injury. Tubes and monitors surrounded her as she was moved into the intensive care unit. Against the odds, Michelle survived the surgery. But there was a second, more devastating reality waiting for her. The baby she had carried for 7 months was gone. The newborn girl, later named Aurora by Michelle and her boyfriend, had been delivered alive, but far too early. At just over 3 pounds, her tiny body was fragile, her lungs underdeveloped. Despite the efforts of medical staff, she could not survive. Aurora was placed in her parents' arms for a short time in the hospital. For Michelle, those moments were filled with a mix of love, grief, and disbelief. The joy of finally holding her daughter was overshadowed by the knowledge that she would never take her home. In the days that followed, Michelle remained in critical care. She was weak, unable to speak for long periods, her throat sore from both the attack and the breathing tube. Visitors described her as pale but determined, her eyes clear with the knowledge that she had survived something extraordinary and horrifying. For the medical team, the case was unforgettable. They knew how close Michelle had come to dying and how rare it was for someone with those injuries and that much blood loss to leave the hospital alive. Meanwhile, in another part of the same facility, detectives kept watch over Dynel Lane. With the baby under police protection and DNA results pending, the truth was closing in. In the quiet of the hospital room, Michelle Wilkins cradled her daughter for the first and last time. Baby Aurora was impossibly small, her features delicate and perfectly formed. She had come into the world far too soon, not through the natural course of birth, but through an act of violence that had torn her from the safety of the womb. The moment was bittersweet. Michelle had imagined holding Aurora many times, in the delivery room surrounded by the joy of family, in a space filled with the cries of a healthy newborn. Instead, the room was hushed. Machines hummed softly in the background. Every movement was careful, reverent. Her boyfriend sat beside her, their hands meeting over the small bundle between them. They whispered her name, Aurora, a name chosen long before this day. It meant dawn, the first light after darkness. But here, the meaning felt almost too heavy to bear. Family members visited in those first days, each encounter carrying the weight of both relief and grief. They were grateful Michelle had survived, yet shattered by the loss of the child she had carried so lovingly. The contrast was stark, the triumph of her survival alongside the emptiness left by Aurora's absence. In the weeks ahead, Michelle would speak of Aurora not as a tragedy, but as her daughter, a person she had known intimately for 7 months, whose kicks and movements had been her daily companion. She spoke of wanting to honor her memory, to ensure that the story of her short life would not be reduced to the crime that had ended it. For the community, Aurora's death underscored the horror of what had happened. Vigils were held. Messages of support came from strangers across the country. The case had struck a chord, not only for its brutality, but for the innocence lost, and for investigators, the grief in that hospital room was a silent reminder of what they were working to prove: that Aurora's life, however brief, had been taken by deliberate choice, and that justice had to follow. As Michelle began her slow recovery, the legal process against Dynel Lane moved forward with speed. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime scene in the basement, the DNA results linking Aurora to Michelle, the medical proof that Lane had not given birth. Each piece fit together with chilling clarity. Prosecutors charged Lane with multiple serious offenses: attempted first-degree murder for the attack on Michelle, first-degree unlawful termination of pregnancy for the taking of Aurora's life, and multiple counts of first and second-degree assault. Each charge reflected the brutality of what had happened and the intent behind it. In court, the defense faced an impossible task. Lane's deception was laid bare: the year-long false pregnancy, the shifting due dates, the staged baby shower, the avoidance of medical appointments. Witnesses testified to her lies, recalling conversations where she spoke as though a healthy pregnancy were underway. The prosecution presented a meticulous timeline of March 18th. They described how Lane lured Michelle to the apartment under the guise of kindness, attacked her with calculated force, and performed a crude cesarean section. They showed the jury the photographs, the broken lamp, the blood-stained bedding, the knife, and explained the attempts Lane made to clean the scene before Dave arrived. Michelle, still healing, took the stand. She recounted the moments before and during the attack in a steady, quiet voice. Her account was not dramatic, but it was powerful. A survivor's truth laid out without embellishment. She spoke of confusion turning to fear, and fear to the cold certainty that she might not live. Medical experts testified about the precision of the abdominal incision, suggesting knowledge of anatomy. This, they argued, showed intent, that Lane had not acted in a fit of rage, but with a plan in mind. The jury deliberated for less than a day. In February 2016, Dynel Lane was found guilty on all counts. The judge, calling the crime a horrific act of depravity, sentenced her to 100 years in prison, a term designed to ensure she would never walk free again. For Michelle, the verdict was a measure of justice, though it could never bring Aurora back. For the community, it was the closing of one chapter in a story that had gripped and horrified them from the start. In the months after the trial, life for Michelle Wilkins became a careful process of rebuilding. Physically, she faced the long road of recovery from her injuries, scars that would remain as permanent reminders of what she endured. Emotionally, she carried the weight of losing Aurora, a grief that would surface in quiet moments and linger in unexpected ways. Yet she refused to let the attack define her entirely. Michelle spoke publicly about her experience, not to dwell on the violence, but to honor her daughter's memory and to warn others of the hidden dangers in seemingly ordinary encounters. Her words were measured but filled with conviction. Trust is a gift, and sometimes it can be the very thing someone exploits. For the Longmont community, the case left a deep imprint. Vigils held in Aurora's name drew hundreds of people, many of whom had never met Michelle but felt connected to her through the shared sense of outrage and compassion. Strangers sent letters, flowers, and messages of support from across the country. Law enforcement officers who worked the case carried their own reflections. For some, it was a reminder of the importance of instinct, the early suspicion of medical staff, the swift coordination between hospital and police, the quick recognition that two seemingly separate emergencies were in fact the same case. Those decisions, made in minutes, helped preserve the evidence needed to bring justice. The tragedy also reignited difficult conversations about Colorado law. At the time, the state did not have a specific fetal homicide statute, meaning prosecutors had to pursue charges under existing laws, such as unlawful termination of pregnancy. For some, this highlighted a gap in legal protections. For others, it underscored the complexities of balancing criminal law with reproductive rights. Through it all, Michelle's resilience became a focal point. She was a survivor of physical violence, profound loss, and the kind of betrayal that few could comprehend. She found ways to speak about Aurora not solely as a victim, but as a symbol of love and light. The name they had chosen, meaning Dawn, became a personal reminder that even in the darkest moments, there can be a beginning after an ending. For most crimes, the facts are eventually filed away in court records, the headlines fade, and life moves on. But for those touched by what happened on March 18, 2015, the memory remains vivid. It is a story about deception, about the fragility of trust, and about the strength it takes to survive the unimaginable. And perhaps above all, it is a reminder that danger does not always come from the places we expect. Sometimes it hides behind a smile, a kind word, and an open door.